Welcome to another episode of the Community Podcast, a conversational podcast exploring the stories, insights, and strategies behind learning-centric communities. Our mission is to inspire listeners by highlighting individuals who are shaping the future of how people come together to learn, grow, and thrive. I'm excited today to welcome Dr. Keith Keating, Chief Learning and Development Officer at BDO Canada and author of numerous books, most recently, The Trusted Learning Advisor. Keith is widely recognized as one of the leading voices in modern learning strategy and workforce development, and he advocates for a shift in how organizations think about learning. Through his writing, speaking, and leadership, Keith explores how learning leaders can evolve from simply delivering courses to becoming trusted advisors who help organizations diagnose their capability gaps, develop their talent, and drive measurable business outcomes. Keith, it's awesome to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
I appreciate you making space for practitioners like myself to share our knowledge with others.
It's an honor for me, and it's a great opportunity to connect and to learn from somebody who has done so much great work in the field. One of the things that I want to just hit the ground running talking about, Keith, is your story as somebody who has really been able to witness so many different facets of what it means to be a learner. As I read your biography, I was really, in many ways, kind of couldn't believe what I was reading. Somebody who maybe didn't have traditional path when it comes to education, find their way back into education at the highest tiers, and then now your life's work is about helping individuals unlock their potential. So, in your own words, Keith, how would you describe your journey to become who you are today?
It started with a really important event. I was born. The path between birth and here, it's been a long one, been quite a few years. I would focus primarily on my struggles with education growing up. So my father was in the military, in the army. I'm an army brat. We moved, I think I lived in 8 countries and 8 different states in the US. Primarily was raised in Germany to begin with, and then Korea, Japan, Hawaii, and then eventually made my way to the US. And as a result, my education system was very skewed. By the time I made it to the US, it was in Florida. There were classes that I was ahead of and then classes that I was behind in. So my father would walk into one classroom and the teacher would say, "Oh, Keith is above average and should skip a grade." The next teacher would say, "He has a learning disability and may want to be held back or even put into a special remedial program." So it was very confusing for both him and myself, and I struggled quite a bit. Eventually, I had to make the decision to drop out of school. There were a number of reasons. To summarize: bullying. My mother had died when I was 14. My emotional struggles as a result of that, and fear in general of school and what I was dealing with. When I dropped out, I had only completed about 2 months of 10th grade. So I'm a high school dropout. I don't even have a full 10th grade education. And when I dropped out, my father said, "You will never amount to anything. You will be destined to a life of fast food." First of all, as if there's something wrong with working in the fast food industry, which there's not. And the teacher said the same thing, but I listened to them and I got a job in fast food. But I knew that I wanted to be something else. I just had no idea what it was. Fast forward a couple of years, there's an ad in the newspaper for a Microsoft Office trainer, and the job was to travel around the country teaching Social Security Administration offices how to use Microsoft Office. And I thought, I know how to use Microsoft Office. How hard could it be to teach? I went to the interview and I was terrible. I had no idea what I was doing. I was so nervous that I coughed the whole time to try and give my brain a chance to catch up to what I was actually supposed to be doing. And they interrupted me and said, "Sounds like you're really sick. Fast forward a week." They called me, but not to come back for an interview, but to give me the job. So I was 17 or 18 years old, and my job was now to go into these offices where it was my parents' age. They were 40 to 45. I was 17, 18. I was their kids' age, and teach them how to use Microsoft Office. I'd never taught. I didn't know what I was doing. The first session, I broke down and ran out, cried, had a good cry in the hallway, composed, went back in, finished. It was bad. It was so bad. But that night I went and studied, and I had to learn. I had to finally learn how to learn. And every night I would spend my evenings after teaching learning the content. What I realized later on was that one of my superpowers is learning something and breaking it down in my brain, and then I can disseminate it back in a way that other people can understand. And so it was about 6 months into this role where I was teaching class on Excel and we were doing Excel formulas. And the light finally went on in somebody's eyes and she got it. And I still remember that rush, that endorphin rush from when she got it, because it was the first time that I can recall feeling like I had something to provide, that I had value, that I had something to contribute to a world where I didn't feel like I fit in or that I was going to constantly be a failure and never succeed. And that is what largely kept me going and learning. And plus, at the same time, it was the dot-com boom. And because I was in that field, whether it was HTML or Dreamweaver or Flash, all of these programs were coming out almost overnight. And so my manager at the time would realize that, hey, I can just give this to Keith because he'll study it really hard. He'll break it down. He'll figure out how to learn it. And then he'll be able to teach it back in a pretty decent way. That set me on the path from having a job to a career to a passion. And now it's a calling because I understand the true power of learning and development and that it can unlock our human potential. Once you learn how to learn and you never stop learning, you can truly become unstoppable.
There were several points in your story, Keith, where I fought the urge to interrupt you because there are so many parallels into what you just shared. I'll share just a few because I think there's an enormous amount of synergy in your personal journey and some of the experiences that I had growing up. I also experienced a critical point in my life when I thought I would amount to nothing. And it actually happened a bit later in life compared to when you experienced your episode of being told that you couldn't amount to anything. And that was when I was a 22-year-old. So I failed out of medical school. My entire experience from K through 16, first 4 years of college, I was hell bent on becoming a doctor because that was the one thing my parents told me that I had to be. And there's many other folks that are in that category for many different reasons. In my particular case, I was not the most gifted student, but I made it work and just had the misfortune of not getting into medical school when I first tried. And I decided, therefore, to accept what my parents had essentially proved to me as the alternative, which is to go to the Caribbean and go to medical school there. You know, you're 22, don't take a gap year like these other crazy kids. Go become a doctor. Don't waste time. And what I like to tell people is that 16 years of education blew up in my face in 4 months when I went to the Caribbean. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to learn because I was being bombarded with things that I had never seen before. First of all, my heart wasn't in it. But beyond the fact that my heart wasn't in it, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to learn, right? Up until that point, I was kind of just fumbling along. I had friends, I had acquaintances, I knew that I could get through difficult concepts. I think some of it was also sheer luck, but it all blew up in my face in December of 2011 when I got a letter from my medical school at the time telling me, unfortunately, you're not able to continue because you failed out of anatomy. That's the one class you cannot fail at the end of your first semester in medical school. I remember the dread that I felt in that moment. For about a couple of hours, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I could do. So that's why it's eerily similar to what you described. I let the termination email sink in for about, let's say, 2 to 3 hours. And my parents knew that I was going to get my yay or nay after my first semester that week of Christmas. So I told my mom first, and then I went downstairs to the basement where my dad had his computer lab. I told my dad, and my dad did not look me in the face. He couldn't look me in the face. And if I ever write a biography or ever do a TED Talk, one of the chapters of the book that I write about myself is going to be, don't just become a regular American. Because those were the words my dad told me. And his implication was, don't just work in fast food. So it's incredibly similar to what you experienced. And I'm sure other listeners, if they really unpack what they have gone through in their formal education or in their journey to become who they are today, they had those inflection points. I was lucky enough to have people in my circle, very few, but it only really takes one person to unlock a door for you. I had one of those people in my life. And less than 2 months after that rejection email, I was doing product training. Crazy similarity here, Keith. I was hired by a company to do product training in the technology space, and I haven't looked back. So that was the stepping stone for me to get more into technology, more into how people learn. And I mean, the beginning point was train them on a tool like Microsoft Word, train them on a piece of software, train them on how to become a more productive version of themselves, leveraging technology. Those were the ingredients that I needed. So I was working with people. There was an element of teaching and there was an element of technology. So I had all the right ingredients in the pot to kind of begin thinking about learning and development. And, 15 years later, almost 14 years later, I'm still in L&D. And now my focus is focusing on organizations and how they harness the power of technology to really make learning that much more impactful. So went on a little bit of a longer reflection there, but I had to share because it's eerily similar how interesting our journeys were in terms of how we got into L&D.
Pivoting from a failure.
Yeah,
I think that's the underlying theme here. That's such a foundational and integral part of learning and development and being human is that we're all going to have these moments of failure, but it's how you return from them. And so I'm glad that you had somebody there who could support you and help you on that path. It's great that you had somebody who could support you and set you on that path pretty soon after you had that experience. I ended up getting that job for two reasons. I had car insurance and I had no criminal record. That's what set me on the path to L&D. Not that anybody believed in me. And I actually asked my manager about a year later, why did you hire me? And she said, you were really bad, but you had car insurance and you had no criminal record. And that's what we needed.
that's what an incredible thing to look back on. The thing that I'll mention about the journey that I think a lot of L&D professionals encounter is as we become better at learning ourselves, right? We become so much more understanding of where others are on their learning journey, right? And I'll use myself as an example. So that first job that I got after I had this crash, right? I thought I was a fairly educated person. I could write essays as a history major in college. But when I was in the real world, right, transitioning from learning as a student, where that was my job essentially, to learning how to become a productive employee in a larger organization where the outcomes really depended on how efficient we all were. When I go back to how I communicated as a 22-year-old, right, I could not tell you, Keith, how embarrassed I feel when I look at some of those emails, right? I mean, literally books. I was writing essays. And I remember I would get responses back that were single sentences, right, from other people, clients, managers, etc. And I always thought to myself, did these people never learn how to write an essay? That was my critique of others, right? Because again, I was so new to the journey. Rearview mirror was just that of an academic exercise in learning and not understanding learning for what it can be, which is a really multi-purpose tool, right? A multi-purpose skill, learning how to learn. So now that I've been 15 years in corporate America doing my own thing now, I have so much empathy and understanding of where others are on their learning journey, because it's a process, right? We all go through it. We all make mistakes, like you're saying. We all learn from our failures. And if somebody isn't where they need to be or where others say they need to be, we need to help them get there. And if they're willing to be coached and taught and they're willing to go on that journey, essentially, then I think the sky's the limit.
If they're willing.
Yeah.
That's the key statement there. They've got to have a growth mindset.
So tell me more about that, Keith. What are some of the ingredients that somebody needs in order to become a better learner when it comes to learning how to learn?
Simply put, the willingness. I deal with people all the time who are not willing, who don't have a growth mindset, who aren't open to feedback. You said earlier that learning is a multifaceted skill. I'm going to push that further to say learning is a survival skill. You don't have the option anymore not to learn. If you do not have a growth mindset, if you are not willing to learn, you are going to get left behind. The world we live in today is now nothing but change. Change is the only constant. The cliche statements, change is happening exponentially, change is the new normal. All of those buzz phrases are absolutely true. And this right now is the slowest pace of change that any of us are going to feel. And the only way to combat constant change is with constant learning. And so for the people who have the mindset of, I'm good, I've learned what I need to learn, know it all is no longer an option. You cannot know it all with the way that change is happening. It's just not simply possible. What was true 2 years ago is not true today. The way that we operated 2 years ago is not the way that we operate today, the way that we're going to operate in a year from now. And so you have to consistently be open to the idea of learning, of thinking differently, of unlearning the behavior or the approach that you might have had previously, and be willing to relearn in order to survive.
I really like that. And I think maybe the one consistent action that we can all do day to day, week to week, and we got to celebrate the small wins because, again, the reality of essentially anybody on this planet is there's too much to do and not enough time, right? But one of the things that I think everybody should try to do is carve out some time to learn, to read, to push the boundaries of their understanding and their capabilities, right? Whatever that may be. And it's something that I strive to do. But again, it can be tough with everything else that's happening. Let's shift the conversation a little bit, Keith, towards moving away from the individual learner and thinking how people can thrive or not when they're in communities. So the work that you've done, and I've had a chance to read your book and research the work that you've done in this space, I think when you move learning away from the individual domain into the communal domain, you have to deal with a lot of challenges that are coming up organizationally, right? Getting people to see the vision of a shared purpose in the same way, right? Getting organizations to understand that learning can be a strategic component to their growth and their success as opposed to something that they just check off as, oh, we've gone through this training, etc., right? Which I think a lot of people can relate to. I would love to hear your take on organizational learning and how, in this era of constant change that we're in, what are some of the things that you advise leaders and organizations to really have down pat when it comes to ensuring that their people can learn and keep up with all this change?
It starts with a learning culture, and not one group owns this concept of learning culture. Sometimes it's put on L&D or HR, but it is a shared aspect of the organization. And so there are different components of it. For example, psychological safety, the space to fail, the space to see others willing to be vulnerable in their own learning, particularly leaders. Unfortunately, many organizations are still hierarchical, and so they'll look to the top to see what type of signals are the top sending. And so for them, it's creating spaces for psychological safety. Failure, for example, the word fail to me is a four-letter acronym: first attempt in learning. And so when we fail, it is a positive data point of what didn't work, bringing us closer to what does work. Additionally, the organization needs to create space and time for learning to happen. With that, every individual must also be accountable for their own learning. And we put a lot of emphasis on an L&D function and a learning culture, again, as if it's part of the collective. But I believe that the foundation of that is each person willing to take a step back and take some ownership of their own learning and development. For example, I don't want anybody else in the world to be responsible for my learning. I don't trust anybody else. I own that, not just as an L&D practitioner, but as a human, as a worker. Therefore, I feel like L&D functions, our job is to enable. Our job is to empower, to encourage. We create the space, we'll create the connections, the tools that you can use, but you have to take ownership of that yourself to want to continue to learn. And I hear sometimes people saying, well, that's L&D that needs to be responsible for that. No, why would you put something so important as your future? And that's what this is. When you're talking about your own learning and development, you're talking about your future, your potential success, making sure that you have the right skills to be employed today, but also tomorrow. I find a lot of functions are stuck in a system that they may not have control over, and maybe they're acting as order takers. Therefore, take ownership yourself and go out and figure out how to learn. I have never gone to an LMS to learn something, ever. But yet we have one. We have one at our organization, and we have the content on there, and we can curate the content for you. But I'm never going to proactively say to somebody, go to the LMS and learn that. I learn in the flow of work. I learn when there's a moment where I have a question in my head. And instead of just letting that question leave, I'm going to write it down if I don't have time right now, or if I have time right now, I'm going to dig into it. I'm going to go to Gen AI most likely, which is my daily coach. I have multiple tools that I use that teach me on a daily basis when I have a question, because it's no longer where you went to Google, you had a question, you went to Google, you got the answer. Now, the way that I use Gen AI is I have a question and my prompt is teach me. Teach me what this is, why it is, how it is, who it is, whatever. And that way I'm actually learning rather than just ticking a box of getting that data point and moving on. But I'm taking control over that. So, long story short, it is about having a learning culture in an organization where there's not a fear of failure that exists, but it's actually supported, it's nurtured. You have a psychologically safe environment to learn, you have space and time to learn, you have leaders who are willing to show examples of what it means to learn, and you have an L&D function that's now enabling, empowering, and encouraging talent to use the tools that L&D is creating. But then most importantly, the individual is part of the greater collective, and they're taking ownership and accountability of their own learning and development.
Yeah, I can't agree more, Keith. And I think when I think about if I were to summarize my own take on a lot of this, a lot of the discussions that are taking place around the role of L&D, learning is not a spectator sport, right? That's another one of those cliche maybe phrases that we've heard over and over again, but it's cliche because it's true, because it's been repeated ad nauseum and it makes sense, right? You definitely do have to take control of your learning. You definitely have to be the one in the driving seat, right? When it comes to dictating the way that you engage with information. And to your point, Keith, there has never been an easier time to get an answer to something. I'll give you just a simple example. Gen AI in the context of, I love what you mentioned about helping it using it as a tool that teaches you. I tell my Gen AI, because I get sick and tired of some of the responses I see of just rows and rows of text, right? One of the things that I designed early on was just give me what I ask for. Explain like I'm 5 years old, kind of thing. And if I need details, I will ask you for those details, but don't lead with details because I don't necessarily need all of that context. So using these tools as supporters in your own learning journey and your acquisition of information is huge. And there's never been a better time to do that, right? The second piece of it is, with this information, with these tools at our constant disposal, they're ubiquitous. We don't really have an excuse when it comes to saying, we can't really say, I don't know the answer to that. Those days are gone.
It means you're not willing to put in the time to figure it out.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's okay to not, it's okay to say that as long as you're following up with, I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out. So let me get back to you and then go and learn it. But no longer can we just simply say, I don't know and leave it at that.
Could not agree more. That's exactly what it is. So, take control, do the bare minimum, right? I think to every listener, if you're unsure about something, you can at least do the bare minimum of investigating, asking, searching for that, and have that be the springboard to maybe something more, more conducive to whatever goal you're trying to achieve, right?
Being curious.
I think curiosity is really the kernel of so much of what's driving people towards their passions that they want to build. One thing that sparked my interest, Keith, as you were sharing your thoughts is, so as an individual, we have these elements that can drive our own learning journeys. When you put people in a collective, right? So we have an organization that checks off all the right boxes, right? So they have psychological safety, they have learning, they allow people to fail, right? They have this ecosystem in which everybody is given the time to, let's say, a couple hours a week to engage in whatever learning that they think is going to be beneficial. It's something that they actually care about, right? How do we transform, and this is the kernel of the work that I do, Keith, is building connection between individuals that all have that shared purpose, right? So some of the ways that I have personally attempted this, let's say, is we do cohort-based models where you have kind of groups of individuals based off of their job title or maybe their tenure, right? Managers, individual contributors, people less than six months, more than 6 months, whatever. Those are some of the ways that historically organizations have nurtured some of these initiatives to create communities. How have you, in the work that you've done, transformed when you have the right people and the right culture? How do you make that ecosystem come to life?
Cohorts are definitely a great way to approach this. We have cohorts, or sometimes if it's smaller groups, we have pods. Additionally, we run large learning events for the entire firm. So, for example, we run what's called the Skill Up Summit. And this is a 3 half-day virtual event that the entire firm is invited to participate in. And this sends a signal that learning is important, learning is value. This is a shared experience. The challenge with stopping at cohorts is you only have those group of 20 going through that experience. So yes, you're creating a community, but you're creating these small microcosm example of communities. And what we're trying to do with Skill Up is to create one large shared experience, one large community that says we value learning and development. And so collectively as an organization, we're going to go through this together. Not, I think that's a missed opportunity to have this collective effort to say, this is valuable. We're going to do this as a team.
Yeah. And I think part of it too is what I think the nirvana, if I can call it that, right? When an organization has reached nirvana is when you have enough of that happening enough times over the course of, let's say, a given time period, right? You have some flagship events, you have pods or cohorts that are continuously being empowered to innovate and push the boundaries of everybody's collective understanding on certain initiatives or projects, right? As that becomes the norm, it just becomes muscle memory for the people in that organization, right? They're not going to hesitate when it comes to suggesting something that people want to learn about, right? Because there's already all these opportunities that they've seen and experienced where they can say, this should be something we do in a cohort. This should be something we do in a pod, right? Why don't we put this down as something that we tackle when we do our next flagship event kind of thing, right? This idea of continuous learning, right? Embedding learning in the flow of work. You mentioned that earlier, Keith. That's basically the thesis of what I do. Right? So we're absolutely on the same page in terms of, learning cannot be an afterthought. It can't be in a repository or in an LMS that you have to, of course, there's value to having, repository of information, but you're not going to have people go and take an asynchronous course or a self-serve course and then have that feed into their day-to-day, right? They need to have that be accessible to them in their moment of work, in their moment of need. I'd love for you to share a little bit about that, Keith. Anything that you found in your experience where that flow of work, learning is kind of supercharged? What leads to that coming together for an organization?
What does this actually mean? So in L&D, we talk about learning the flow of work. You go and say that to somebody outside of L&D, they're like, what does that mean? So it's translating our language into theirs. And so where that's supercharged, where you have an environment where you don't have silos. When you have silos, that flow of work learning is going to be regimented to just that silo. This is one of the things that we're trying to currently evolve at BDO is breaking down those silos so that you have those relationships. You know who to go to when you have that question. So supercharged learning in the flow of work is having a network to have access to, not having silos, having connections holistically across the organization, knowing where to go, knowing what type of tools to use. For example, flow of work. Gen AI for me is how I learn in the flow of work. When I have a question, I stop and I take time at that moment to be curious, to understand, to learn as that's happening. Feedback, rather than waiting for your annual performance review or biannual, whatever it is, but creating a culture where that happens in real time, that you have a safe enough space to give feedback or to ask for feedback right then. So these are all different examples of how you can start to supercharge learning the flow of work.
Yeah, there's some gems there, Keith, for sure, that I'm sure listeners will appreciate, but also that you can start applying, right? So
Mhm.
organizations are using these kinds of tools, and the marketplace is full of innovators that are building tools that will surface both knowledge and opportunities to connect in the flow of work. So, I mean, maybe the average person listening in, they can connect to, us talking about Slack or Microsoft Teams or any one of these plugins that maybe lives in whatever ecosystem you're in, Asana or Monday.com, whatever, right? So it's a task management tool, but it has an AI component that's connected to a knowledge base. I mean, there's all these different ways that you can now connect technology to one another to break these silos and to have information be that much more accessible. I love the part that you mentioned about people as well, because when we think about silos, right, at almost every organization that I've worked at or worked with, silos tend to be very insular. People feel a lot of passion towards their own silo. This is what I own. This is how it's always been, right? And breaking silos requires so much in the way of building consensus and shared understanding. And hey, it's not an attack on you and the work that you've done in your department, but it's about the common goal. It's the vision that we're all driving towards, to create these synergistic paths of collaboration between your department and my department and your SMEs and my SMEs, that kind of thing, which I think a lot of folks listening will appreciate. One of the things I definitely want to touch on before we conclude the episode, Keith, is this idea of trusted learning advisor, which of course is the title of your book. And I'm noticing this in my work, and I think a lot of L&D professionals and others that are active in our space will understand and appreciate the fact that for a long time, I think learning has been you complete whatever has been assigned, or you go through a certain curriculum, and then you're kind of done until the next round comes up, right? So it was a very content completion kind of checking off the box type of an exercise, I would say for most of its history, right? But when you have learners come in as advisors, people that understand learning, I should say, come in as advisors to the business itself, right? When people are coming in and saying, okay, This is how learning will actually move the needle for the organization, address business outcomes, lead to tangible changes in profit or loss. Then learning becomes more than just a something that you check off and something that, gives you information. It is something that actually transforms your business success. That was my read at a very high level, of course, not to summarize the book, but that was my read on your thesis. I'd love to hear, Keith, what your take is on this idea of individuals that understand learning becoming advisors to businesses and organizations.
I'm not sure, though, that everyone listening actually understands learning. I have found over the years that in many cases, people cycle in and out of the learning and development function, not because they have expertise as a practitioner, but because they knew a specific tool, or they were in the business, or there wasn't really any place else to go. Generally speaking, 50% of people I've talked to cycled in from the business. So, first of all, we have to make sure that we understand learning. And if you think that you understand learning, then I'm going to ask you this next question. Do you understand the science of learning? Can you tell me the 5 characteristics of learning science? Because if you can't, then in my eyes, you're not yet qualified as a learning and development practitioner, because there is a science to what we do, to how we do it, to why we do it. And everything that we do must be rooted in those learning sciences. So if you have not read the book, Make It Stick: The Science of Successful Learning, read it, memorize it, live it. I have nothing to do with the book. I'm not associated with it in any way, but it is the foundation of everything that we should be doing. So let's assume then that the practitioners have a learning foundation. The next challenge is, do you have a deep understanding of the business? Can you speak the language of the business? Because most people don't want to talk to L&D practitioners. They don't know what an LMS is. They don't know who Kirkpatrick is. They don't know what a level 1, level 2, level 3 evaluation is. And it's not their job to know. It's our job to be able to translate what we're saying in a language and vocabulary that matters to the business. Our job is to know the business just as good as our stakeholders, if not even better. That's how we become true trusted learning advisors versus order takers. And I would say predominantly most of the field are order takers. Now, in their defense, we've been order takers since the beginning of our industry. In the 1800s, when the manufacturing industry was booming, managers needed workers to do the thing. And so somebody had to train them how to move this widget here. The manager decided what that was. And so the manager told whoever the quote trainer was, this is what you need to go train them on. And that's how we operated. So that's how we began. And then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we started to have other methodologies and different research that said, hey, there's actually a different way to do this. And so now we're trying to change how the business sees us, but we're not able to speak their language. I will wholeheartedly admit, when I joined this industry, I was 100% an order taker. I didn't know anything different. And I also grew up in a military family where we took orders. And so for me, it was a very easy transition. Tell me what you want me to do, and I'm going to go do it. Oh, you have a course you want on the LMS? Perfect. Let me figure out how to create a course and what an LMS is, but then I'm going to get it on there for you. And I thought for years that LMS equaled learning. No one ever told me differently. It wasn't until after years and years and years of doing this and seeing enough different variations and versions to finally have a point of view that was based on experience, based on what worked before, what didn't work before. And then I started offering my point of view about how to make it even better. And that's when the business would start to push back. I was like, well, wait, but I've done this before. I'm trying to help you. They're like, no, 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 just take the order and go and do it. This is what I want. I want it in 2 weeks. I want a 30-minute web-based training. I want a 20-minute e-learning. I want a 2-day sales training that's going to change our revenue model and make our salespeople sell stuff. Actually, you know what? You don't have 2 days. You have a day and a half. This is the world that we operate in. And the challenge is ultimately that we haven't built up the vocabulary, we haven't built up the expertise, we haven't looked at the research that's out there. We aren't rooting what we're doing in the science of learning to be able to operate any differently than an order taker. And there's a difference between being an order taker and taking the order. Order taker, the order comes in and you're doing exactly what was told of you. But taking the order is something that all of us should be doing. You have the conversation with your stakeholder, you take that order, but then you don't just execute on it. You take a step back, you do your analysis, then you design the solution. Then you bring it back to your stakeholder to have a discussion about why what they brought you was the right way or why it may not have been the best way. That you show the data to support this, you show the voice of the learner, the voice of the customer to support this, and then you propose an alternative solution that's going to be even better than what was originally brought to them. So there's order taking, which we don't want to do, but there is taking the order.
Keith, that was fantastic. And actually, the last piece around taking that concept of, you are, at the end of the day, we are serving learners
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally, right? So we have to understand how to do that in the best way possible. And I mean, some of these aspects that you shared are really, really powerful in terms of speaking the right language, which I see all the time in my work, right? We're talking about the same things, but using different words. And that contributes to confusion, misalignment, and then before you know it, things are off the rails because we don't know what we're talking about. We never had a shared language. But also that understanding and the flexibility to be able to say, yes, a lot of this is going to be dictated by the needs of the organization and what people want from us. But we can't just do that blindly. There needs to be a creative, constructive pushback and or conversation around what's being done and why is it being done and is it being done for the right reasons and to achieve the right outcomes, right? So I think, again, a lot of food for thought, Keith. This is fantastic. I hope it inspires our listeners to think about some of these ideas a bit more deeply. As we close out, Keith, I want to ask you what is most exciting for you on your horizon, either as an individual practitioner, as a leader in the space, or just as a learner, as a lifelong learner yourself? What are you most looking forward to, let's say, the next 3 to 5 years, which is a million years in terms of the pace of change, but I'd love to hear kind of where you think the world is headed.
For me personally, I love how Gen AI has the ability to democratize learning because all of us have access to some form of these tools that can help us learn. For me, I love having a coach in my pocket. It's making me better at everything I'm doing, whether it's dealing with emails or coaching my team members or learning how to be more self-aware and take a step back, reevaluate myself, or learn new skills. From an industry standpoint, I'm excited to see how the industry evolves or doesn't evolve. I get asked a lot about what the future of work is going to look like, particularly for learning and development. I don't think that the way that our industry operates today is going to be in existence, I don't know, 10 years from now. We're not going to be needed the same way that we're being used right now. I had a perfect example that actually happened yesterday. We've had some business partners ask for some training content to be created, some e-learning. And some individuals on my team are still struggling with the idea of using AI and the fact that we've got to be quicker. And they said, I don't remember the exact timeline, but it would take weeks. The business yesterday spent 2 hours on created exactly what they were asking for. And then they came back to us and said, we did this in 2 hours. Why are you telling us that it takes weeks? And I love this. And I had a call today with the team about this and said, this is a perfect catalytic moment where you're experiencing the reality of the world and that the way that we operated historically cannot be the same way that we operate. Someone else had told me that it was going to take 11 months to build a new program. And my response was, How many months does it take to make a new life? It only takes 9 months to make a human. And yet you're telling me it takes 11 months to design a learning program? Absolutely not acceptable. And the business is telling us absolutely not acceptable because we can go out and do it ourselves. And that's the greatest risk that we have is if we don't hurry up and evolve, the business is going to figure out they can do okay learning. And it might be okay today, but it's getting even better. So by tomorrow, they can do pretty good learning without us, with just some good prompts. So excited to see how we evolve or how we don't evolve. For me, I see us evolving as problem solvers. If you're willing to be curious, if you're willing to say yes to programs, to problems, to tasks that aren't, quote, learning and development. Half of what I do every day has nothing to do with learning and development. But I'm trying to build the reputation in our firm that if you have a problem, you can go to the learning function and they will help you. We may not be the ones to solve it, but we're going to be the ones that connect you to a potential solution. We're going to be the ones that help you feel heard, that help you feel seen, that help you feel there's somebody out there who cares. Because in 5 years, when someone else says, let's get rid of the training function, we can stay on the sidelines and say, yeah, sure, get rid of them. But we're not the training function. We're here solving problems. We just happen to use learning and development as one of the tools to solve your problems.
That is gives me a lot of hope for the future. Being an L&D practitioner, Keith, I think everybody is going to appreciate not only the rapid pace of change, but I think one of the key takeaways from this conversation has been, we have the power to chart our own course as L&D practitioners and as people that are in positions of influence within our organizations. Last question, Keith. Where can our listeners find out more about you? Social media, websites, all that good stuff. What would you like to share?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so if we're not connected, please connect there so that we can continue to learn from each other. And then keithkeating.com.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to put those in the show notes. Any other last thoughts, Keith, around maybe something we covered, something we didn't cover? I always love to give that opportunity to my guests to share anything else that might be on their minds as we wrap up.
3 words that all of us need to embody: never stop learning.
Can't think of a better way to end this episode. Thank you so much, Keith, for your time. This was a wonderful discussion, and I hope it's not the last one we have.
Thanks again for having me.
Of course.